Okay, then the Buddha says, the monk might wish, may I become a conqueror of discontent and delight. Here, discontent means becoming upset, becoming dissatisfied. For example, becoming dissatisfied with having to live in the forest, just in a simple hut, having to go on alms round every day, missing out on the pleasures, and the worldly pleasures and enjoyments. So that is discontent. And often when that arises, if it becomes very strong, then it will lead the monastic person to disrobe and return to the worldly life. Then the opposite of this is what's called delight, but this is not the spiritual delight, but this is the tendency of the mind to be seeking delight in, you might call, worldly enjoyments. So maybe, say, since in the monk's life there's not much entertainment, so the monk might be thinking of what kind of food he's going to get with the meal offering that day or the next day, or if he gets thinking, how can I get beautiful robes, how can I get a nice, instead of having this little bamboo hut out in the forest, how can I get a nice solid cottage with 4 or 5 rooms? Okay, so to become the conqueror of discontent and delight, one has to follow this threefold training. When one follows the training diligently, then one begins to experience an inner happiness, an inner joy, which stays with one. It becomes a kind of footing, like an island that gives one a foothold, and that will support one amongst the tempestuous currents of worldly desire. And so one doesn't become discontent, thinking that one is missing out on the enjoyments of the worldly life, because now one has this inner pleasure, this inner happiness, which swells up from the mind itself. And because one has access to that inner happiness, the mind doesn't dwell upon the prospect of indulging in worldly delights. And so in this way, one conquers discontent and delight. Okay, see, now we'll be moving away from somewhat mundane desires to more spiritual desires. So first to conquer discontent and delight, then comes the wish, may I become a conqueror of fear and dread, and may fear and dread not conquer me. This is something that can arise in a monk who's living out in the forest. Because when one is living in the forest, it could be far away from others. Even if one is living in a monastery with huts spread out in the forest, one can have fear of wild animals. I guess in India in the Buddha's time, there was still, the forests were quite thick, so there would be animals like tigers, leopards, bears, hyenas. And then the mind can project all kinds of wild ideas. So sometimes if the wind is blowing, and then the branches are rustling against one another, one gets the fear, the tiger is coming to get me. The leopard is coming. And then in ancient India, in the Buddhist time, and even in Asia today, there's a widespread belief in ghosts. And I mean, I've known mature, highly educated monks in Sri Lanka who still believe in ghosts, even Westerners. And So when you're living alone or in a very quiet place at night, and then there's this, again, the wind blowing, rustling of leaves, strange sounds, the candle goes out, you have no matches, then comes the fear, the ghosts or the zombies are going to come, catch me and eat me. And then of course, the monks will be familiar with the stories from the Pali commentaries, which talk about how these, we call them yakshas, these terrible, ferocious monsters come and they eat up monks living alone in the forest. One starts thinking, uh-oh, I'm going to be the subject of the next story. They'll come and they'll find me with my head eaten off, just the body, with everything from the neck down remaining, but the head is gone, or the body is torn open, and the internal organs are all gone, and so one becomes very afraid. Okay, so to conquer this fear, then when one has strong meditation, then even though one might hear animals coming, even though there might really be animals out there, but because one has the strong power of Samadhi, one doesn't let fear arise in the mind, but one can keep the mind calm and equanimous under those conditions. And sometimes it's said that those monks who have strong power of Samadhi, particularly if they have developed strong metta and karuna, loving kindness and compassion, they can dwell even amidst the wild animals, and the wild animals have just no thoughts of harming them, of injuring them. Like I know there was one monk, an elderly German monk who was living in Sri Lanka. He was living in a cave, or he came to stay in a cave. Then when he was in that cave, maybe a couple of days after he took up his residence there, a bear came into the cave. And the bear saw this monk living in the cave and thought, what is he doing taking over my house? And so the bear came after him. And this monk was very good in meditation, especially in metta meditation. And so what he did was to put his mind into the frame of the metta meditation, and then he started to recite the Metta Sutta, the Buddha's discourse on loving kindness. Then the bear, as the monk was chanting, stopped his forward movement, turned around, and walked out. But I think the monk changed his residence after that. He didn't stay in the cave. Okay, so when one fulfills this threefold training, then one is able to overcome this fear and dread. Okay, next comes the wish, may I become one to obtain at will, without trouble or difficulty, the 4 jhanas that constitute the higher mind and provide a pleasant abiding here and now. So to attain the jhanas, he has to fulfill, it's said, the threefold training. Though actually, to obtain the jhanas, one doesn't actually need the training in vipassana itself, since just the training in samadhi or in samatha is able to lead to the jhanas. But I think in order to keep the whole training intact, it's repeated with regard to each of these benefits. Okay, when we come to a later sutta, we'll go into the 4 jhanas themselves, but here we just take them as a group. Okay, so next comes a wish to reach the higher meditative stages beyond the jhanas. So if the monk should wish, may I contact with the body and abide in those liberations that are peaceful and immaterial or formless, transcending forms, let him fulfill this threefold training. And this passage is referring to what are called the 4 formless meditative attainments. In Pali, these are called the arupa samapatti. Okay, so the 4 jhanas are sometimes called the 4 rupa samapatti. That means the 4 attainments with form, because they're based on some kind of, usually it's a visible form as the object, some kind of bright light, bright image. But beyond the 4 jhanas, there are 4 other meditative attainments which do not have any form as their object. These are refinements in the development of Samadhi. You've come across these, I'm sure those who have read suttas extensively, you've come across these several times. They're called the base of the infinity of space, the base of the infinity of consciousness, the base of nothingness, the base of neither perception nor non-perception. We will encounter them again, and then I'll explain them when we come to them. But here it's sufficient just to know that the attainment of these states, these formless liberations, depends especially on observing the precepts and fulfilling the training in Samadhi. And when they're called liberations, this has to be taken in a qualified sense. They're not liberations in the sense that they, by themselves, bring liberation from samsara, from birth and death. But rather they're called liberations because they liberate the mind temporarily from its connection to material form. And if one masters these formless meditations without developing wisdom, they will lead one to rebirth in the formless realms. There are realms of existence which correspond to the formless meditations. And so one who masters the formless meditations without developing insight or wisdom will tend to rebirth in the formless realms, which are very peaceful, very long-lasting, but from the Buddha's point of view, they are not in any way the ultimate goal.